Welcome to another journey into the darkest corners of American history, where we uncover the stories they tried to bury forever. Today, we dive into a tale so disturbing that it was deliberately erased from every history book, banned from every archive, and forgotten by time itself. This is the macabre secret hidden behind the Holloway Inn, a story that will make you question everything you thought you knew about the Wild West. In the winter of 1882, deep in the Missouri Ozarks, there stood an inn that welcomed weary travelers with promises of warm beds and hot meals. But beneath its charming facade lay a horror so profound that when the truth finally emerged, the entire town conspired to erase it from existence. What began as a simple investigation into missing travelers would uncover a network of depravity that stretched across 3 states and claimed the lives of over 60 innocent souls. Before we begin this descent into madness, make sure to subscribe and hit that notification bell, because stories like this one are exactly why we dig deep into the forgotten chapters of our past. Now, let's step back in time to a place where civilization was just a thin veneer over something far more primitive and terrifying. The Missouri Ozarks in 1882 was a land caught between worlds. The Civil War had ended 17 years earlier, but its scars still marked the landscape like open wounds. Reconstruction had brought federal troops and carpetbaggers, but they rarely ventured into the deep hollows and remote valleys where old ways died hard and new laws meant little. It was in this lawless frontier that the Holloway Inn found its perfect hunting ground. The inn sat at the crossroads of 2 major trading routes, about 30 miles southwest of Springfield, Missouri. Travelers heading west to California or south to Arkansas would often stop there for the night, drawn by the warm glow of lanterns in the windows and the promise of safety in numbers. The building itself was impressive for the region, a 2-story structure built from local limestone with a wide front porch and enough rooms to accommodate 20 guests. But it wasn't the building that made the Holloway Inn special. It was the family that ran it. Ezekiel Holloway had arrived in the Ozarks in 1878 with his wife Martha and their 3 adult children, claiming to be refugees from the violence that still plagued Kansas in the aftermath of Bleeding Kansas. They had money, which was unusual for newcomers, and they used it to buy not just the inn, but also several hundred acres of surrounding land. The locals were initially suspicious of the Holloways, as mountain folk tend to be of outsiders. But Ezekiel was a charming man with silver hair and kind eyes, the sort of person who could make you feel like an old friend within minutes of meeting him. Martha was quieter, but equally welcoming, always ready with a hot meal and a sympathetic ear. Their children, 2 sons named Caleb and Joshua, and a daughter named Rebecca, seemed like model citizens, attending the local church and helping their neighbors during hard times. For 3 years, the Holloway Inn operated without incident. Travelers came and went, leaving satisfied reviews in the guest book that Martha kept on the front desk. The family became pillars of the small community, with Ezekiel serving as an unofficial mediator in local disputes, and Martha organizing charity drives for families in need. They seemed like the perfect example of how outsiders could integrate into Ozark society. But perfection, as any student of human nature knows, is often just a mask worn by those with the most to hide. The first sign that something was wrong came in the spring of 1881, when a traveling merchant named Henry Caldwell failed to arrive at his destination in Little Rock. Caldwell had been carrying a substantial sum of money, the proceeds from selling farm equipment in Kansas City, and his family was expecting him home within the week. When he didn't arrive, his brother James set out to retrace his route. James Caldwell's investigation led him to the Holloway Inn, where the family confirmed that Henry had stayed there 2 nights earlier. According to Ezekiel, Henry had left early in the morning, heading south toward Arkansas. He had seemed in good spirits and had paid his bill in full. There was nothing suspicious about his departure, nothing to suggest that anything had gone wrong. But James Caldwell was a persistent man, and something about the Holloway's story didn't sit right with him. He spent 3 days searching the roads between the inn and Little Rock, talking to every farmer, every shopkeeper, every person who might have seen his brother. No one had seen Henry Caldwell after he left the Holloway Inn. When James returned to confront the family, he found them sympathetic but unhelpful. Martha suggested that Henry might have taken a different route, perhaps deciding to visit friends or conduct additional business along the way. Ezekiel offered to help search the surrounding area, claiming that travelers sometimes got lost in the maze of mountain roads and ended up wandering for days before finding their way back to civilization. The search turned up nothing. Henry Caldwell had simply vanished, as if he had never existed at all. His horse, his wagon, his money, all gone without a trace. James Caldwell left the Ozarks convinced that his brother was dead, but with no evidence to support his suspicions, there was nothing he could do. Henry Caldwell's disappearance might have remained an isolated incident, if not for a series of similar cases that began to emerge over the following months. William Patterson, a cattle buyer from Texas, vanished while traveling through the region in June 1881. Thomas Mitchell, a prospector heading to Colorado, disappeared in August. By the end of the year, at least 6 men had gone missing in the same general area, all of them carrying substantial amounts of money. The pattern was becoming impossible to ignore, but local law enforcement was either unwilling or unable to investigate properly. The sheriff of the county where the Holloway Inn was located was a man named Jeremiah Briggs, who had a reputation for being more interested in collecting bribes than solving crimes. When concerned citizens approached him about the missing travelers, he dismissed their worries as unfounded paranoia. Briggs argued that the frontier was a dangerous place where men could disappear for any number of reasons. They might have been killed by bandits, attacked by wild animals, or simply decided to change their travel plans without informing anyone. He saw no reason to waste time and resources investigating what he considered to be isolated incidents. But the families of the missing men were not satisfied with Briggs' explanations. They began to organize their own search efforts, pooling their resources to hire private investigators and offer rewards for information about their loved ones. It was through these efforts that Detective Marcus Webb first became involved in the case. Webb was a former Pinkerton agent who had built a reputation as one of the most skilled investigators in the Midwest. He had been hired by the families of 3 missing travelers to investigate their disappearances, and he approached the task with the methodical precision that had made him famous. Webb began by mapping out the last known locations of the missing men, looking for patterns that might reveal what had happened to them. What he found was disturbing. All of the missing men had disappeared within a 20-mile radius of the Holloway Inn, and all of them had been traveling alone with significant amounts of cash. But Webb was too experienced to jump to conclusions. He knew that correlation wasn't causation, and he needed more evidence before he could accuse a respected family of murder. So he decided to go undercover, posing as a traveling salesman with a substantial bankroll, and see what he could learn about the Holloways from the inside. Webb spent weeks preparing for his undercover operation, creating a detailed backstory, and gathering the props he would need to play his role convincingly. He obtained genuine business cards from a medical supply company in Kansas City, forged letters of introduction from satisfied customers, and even arranged for associates to send telegrams to the inn confirming his identity if anyone became suspicious. Webb arrived at the inn on a humid evening in late July 1882, carrying a leather satchel that he claimed contained the proceeds from selling medical supplies throughout Kansas and Missouri. He had crafted his persona carefully, presenting himself as a successful but somewhat naive businessman who was new to frontier travel and unfamiliar with its dangers. The Holloways welcomed him warmly, just as they had welcomed countless other travelers. Ezekiel personally showed him to his room, a comfortable space on the 2nd floor with a view of the surrounding mountains. Martha served him a hearty dinner of fried chicken and cornbread, refusing to accept payment because, as she put it, hospitality is a sacred duty in these parts. But Webb noticed things that other guests might have missed, the way Caleb and Joshua watched him during dinner, their eyes constantly returning to his satchel, the way Rebecca asked seemingly innocent questions about his travel plans and whether anyone was expecting him in Little Rock, the way the family exchanged glances when they thought he wasn't looking, communicating in a silent language that spoke of shared secrets. Most disturbing of all was what Webb discovered when he explored the inn after the family had gone to bed. The building was larger than it appeared from the outside, with a maze of corridors and rooms that seemed to serve no obvious purpose. In the basement, he found what appeared to be a workshop, complete with tools and workbenches, but the tools weren't the sort you'd use for carpentry or blacksmithing. The basement workshop was a chamber of horrors that would haunt Webb for the rest of his life. Along one wall hung an array of surgical instruments, bone saws and scalpels, and other devices that had no business being in an inn. There were also larger tools, hammers and axes and knives of various sizes, all of them showing signs of recent use and careful maintenance. But it was the workbenches that truly revealed the purpose of the room. Their surfaces were stained with dark patches that Webb recognized as dried blood, and the wood showed the deep gouges and cuts that could only come from repeated use in dismembering bodies. Beneath the benches, he found buckets and basins that reeked of death and decay, along with coils of rope and chains that had obviously been used to restrain victims. Webb also found evidence of recent construction in the basement, areas where the stone walls had been rebuilt and the mortar was still relatively fresh. When he examined these areas more closely, he detected a smell that made his blood run cold. It was the sweet, cloying odor of decomposition, faint but unmistakable to someone who had seen as much death as Marcus Webb. The detective's exploration of the inn revealed other disturbing features. There were hidden passages behind false walls, allowing movement between rooms without being seen by guests. There were peepholes that allowed observation of guest rooms, and listening tubes that carried conversations from one part of the building to another. The entire structure had been designed as a trap, with multiple ways to monitor and control anyone who stayed there. But Webb was a professional, and he knew that suspicions weren't enough. He needed concrete evidence, something that would convince a jury and ensure that justice was served. So he continued his charade, playing the role of the unsuspecting traveler while gathering intelligence about the family's operations. Over the next 3 days, Webb learned that the Holloways had a system that was both simple and terrifyingly effective. They would identify wealthy travelers, usually men traveling alone, and determine whether anyone was expecting them at their destination. If the traveler was isolated, with no one likely to come looking for them immediately, they would become a target. The selection process was more sophisticated than Webb had initially realized. The family had developed a network of informants throughout the region, including corrupt officials, crooked merchants, and other criminals who would provide information about potential victims. They knew which travelers were carrying large amounts of money, which ones were traveling alone, and which ones had no strong family connections that might prompt a search if they disappeared. The method of murder was simple but effective. The family would drug the victim's evening meal with laudanum, a common painkiller that was readily available and nearly tasteless when mixed with strong coffee or alcohol. Once the victim was unconscious, they would be taken to the basement, where Ezekiel would kill them with a single blow to the head, using a specially designed hammer that left distinctive marks. The disposal of bodies was equally methodical. The victims would be dismembered in the basement workshop, with different parts buried in various locations around the property. The family had created an elaborate map of burial sites, coded to prevent discovery if it fell into the wrong hands. Some remains were buried in the woods, others in the fields, and still others were dissolved in acid or burned in specially constructed furnaces. Webb estimated that the family had been operating this way for at least 4 years, possibly longer. Based on the number of fresh burial sites he'd identified around the property, and the information he had gathered from his network of contacts, he believed they had killed at least 60 people, making them one of the most prolific serial-killing families in American history. The Holloway Inn wasn't just a place of lodging, it was a slaughterhouse, a carefully designed trap that had been claiming victims for years without anyone suspecting the truth. The family had perfected their methods through practice, learning from their mistakes and refining their techniques to minimize the risk of discovery. On his 4th night at the inn, Webb made his move. He had sent a coded telegram to his contacts in Springfield, requesting immediate assistance, and he knew that help was on the way. But he also knew that he couldn't wait much longer. The family was becoming suspicious of his extended stay, and he had caught Caleb searching his room while he was supposedly out for a walk. That evening, Webb pretended to drink the coffee that Martha served with dinner, but he had actually switched cups when no one was looking. He had learned to recognize the bitter aftertaste of laudanum, and had been careful to avoid consuming anything that might be drugged. He then retired to his room and waited, listening for the sounds that would tell him the family was preparing to make their move. He didn't have to wait long. Around midnight, he heard footsteps in the corridor outside his room, followed by the soft sound of his door being opened. Through slitted eyes, he watched as Caleb and Joshua entered his room, moving with the practiced stealth of men who had done this many times before. The brothers approached his bed cautiously, one carrying a rope, and the other holding a cloth soaked in chloroform. They had clearly done this before, their movements coordinated and efficient. But as they reached for his apparently unconscious form, Webb struck. He had positioned himself so that he could grab the pistol hidden under his pillow, and he had it pointed at Caleb's head before either brother could react. The surprise on their faces was complete, transforming quickly into the cold calculation of cornered predators. "Nobody move," Webb said quietly, his voice carrying the authority of a man who had faced down killers before. "I'm Detective Marcus Webb, and you're all under arrest for murder." The confrontation that followed was brief but violent. Joshua lunged for Webb's gun, apparently believing that he could overpower the detective before he could fire. But Webb was ready for such a move, and his shot took Joshua in the chest, sending him crashing to the floor with blood spreading across his shirt. Caleb tried to flee, but Webb tackled him before he could reach the door. The younger Holloway was strong and desperate, fighting with the fury of a man who knew his life was forfeit if he was captured. The two men crashed into furniture and walls as they struggled, their fight echoing through the inn like thunder. The gunshot and the sounds of struggle brought the rest of the family running, and Webb found himself facing Ezekiel and Martha, both armed with knives and looking far different from the kindly innkeepers they had pretended to be. The mask of civilization had fallen away, revealing the predators beneath. "You should have minded your own business," Ezekiel snarled, his kind eyes now cold and calculating. "You should have taken your money and left like all the others." "The others didn't leave," Webb replied, keeping his gun trained on the older man while maintaining his grip on Caleb. "You killed them, just like you were planning to kill me." What followed was a standoff that lasted until dawn, with Webb holding the family at gunpoint while they waited for the federal marshals he had summoned. The Holloways alternated between threats and attempts at bribery, offering Webb substantial sums of money if he would agree to forget what he had seen. Martha was particularly venomous in her threats, describing in graphic detail what they would do to Webb if he didn't release her son. She spoke of torture techniques that revealed a level of sadism that went far beyond simple murder for profit. The woman who had served him dinner with a smile was revealed to be a monster who took pleasure in inflicting pain. When the federal marshals finally arrived at dawn, they found a scene that would be burned into their memories forever. Joshua Holloway lay dead on the floor of Webb's room, while the rest of the family was held at gunpoint by the detective. The inn itself bore the signs of the violent struggle, with broken furniture and bloodstains marking the places where the fight had taken place. The Holloways were taken into custody, but not before Martha tried to set fire to the inn, apparently hoping to destroy evidence of their crimes. She had managed to ignite some papers in the office before being subdued, but the fire was quickly extinguished before it could spread to the rest of the building. The investigation that followed was one of the most extensive in Missouri history up to that point. Federal agents, local law enforcement, and volunteers from surrounding communities descended on the Holloway property, determined to uncover the full extent of the family's crimes. What they found exceeded even Webb's worst estimates. The basement of the inn contained not just the surgical tools he had discovered, but also a collection of personal effects taken from victims. Watches, jewelry, money, and other valuables were hidden throughout the building, some of it dating back to 1878, suggesting that the killings had begun almost immediately after the family's arrival in the Ozarks. The investigators also discovered a sophisticated system of record-keeping that revealed the true scope of the family's crimes. Hidden in a secret compartment in Ezekiel's desk, they found a ledger that contained the names of victims, the dates of their murders, and detailed inventories of the valuables taken from each one. The ledger was written in Ezekiel's careful handwriting and showed a level of organization and premeditation that was truly chilling. The ledger revealed that the family had killed at least 63 people over a period of 4 years, making them one of the most prolific serial killing families in American history. The victims included traveling salesmen, prospectors heading to Colorado, families moving west, and even a few local residents who had become suspicious of the inn's operations. But the most horrific discoveries were made on the property itself. Using the coded maps found in the ledger, investigators began a systematic excavation of the Holloway land. They found bodies buried in the woods, in the fields, and even under the inn's foundation. Some were complete skeletons, while others had been dismembered and scattered across multiple locations. The condition of the remains told a story of systematic murder and disposal that chilled even experienced lawmen. Many of the victims showed signs of blunt force trauma to the skull, consistent with the family's preferred method of killing. Others appeared to have been shot or stabbed, suggesting that not all of the murders had gone according to plan. The excavation also revealed evidence of the family's experimentation with different methods of body disposal. Some remains showed signs of having been dissolved in acid, while others had been burned in furnaces specially constructed for that purpose. The family had clearly been refining their techniques over time, learning from experience to become more efficient killers. As the investigation continued, the true scope of the Holloway family's crimes became clear. They had not been operating in isolation, but were part of a larger network of criminals that extended across multiple states. The ledger contained references to associates in Kansas, Arkansas, and Texas, suggesting that the family had been part of a coordinated criminal enterprise. The network operated through a system of mutual protection and information sharing. Members would warn each other about law enforcement activities, provide false alibis when needed, and help dispose of stolen goods through established channels. The Holloways had been just one node in this larger criminal enterprise, but they had been among the most successful and prolific. The investigation revealed that the family had been incredibly careful about selecting their victims, targeting people who were unlikely to be missed immediately and who carried substantial amounts of money or valuables. They had also been methodical about disposing of evidence, using their network of associates to help launder stolen goods and create false documentation when needed. The family's success in avoiding detection for so long was due partly to their careful planning and partly to the corruption that plagued frontier law enforcement. Sheriff Jeremiah Briggs was arrested as part of the investigation, charged with accepting bribes to ignore the disappearances and obstruct justice. Several other local officials were also implicated in the conspiracy. The trial of the Holloway family began in Springfield in the spring of 1883 and quickly became a national sensation. Newspapers from across the country sent reporters to cover the proceedings, and the courtroom was packed every day with spectators eager to hear the details of the case. The prosecution, led by District Attorney William Morrison, painted a picture of a family that had used the cover of hospitality to lure victims to their deaths. They presented evidence from the excavations, testimony from Detective Webb, and excerpts from Ezekiel's ledger to build a case that left little doubt about the family's guilt. Morrison's opening statement was particularly powerful as he described the systematic nature of the family's crimes and the cold calculation that had gone into each murder. He argued that the Holloways had perverted the sacred tradition of frontier hospitality, turning what should have been a refuge into a death trap. The prosecution's case was methodical and devastating. Witness after witness testified to the family's deception and the systematic nature of their crimes. The ledger entries were read aloud in court, each one representing a life that had been snuffed out for nothing more than greed. Detective Webb's testimony was particularly compelling as he described his undercover investigation and the moment when he realized the true nature of the Holloway family. His detailed account of the basement workshop and the evidence of systematic murder left the courtroom in stunned silence. The prosecution also called several local residents who testified about suspicious activities they had observed around the inn. A neighboring farmer described seeing the Holloway men digging in their fields at night, while a traveling preacher recalled noticing an unusual number of fresh graves in the family cemetery. Medical experts testified about the condition of the remains found on the property, describing the various methods of murder and dismemberment that had been employed. Their clinical descriptions of the violence inflicted on the victims created a horrifying picture of the family's brutality. The defense, meanwhile, attempted to portray the family as victims of circumstance who had been driven to desperate measures by poverty and isolation. Defense attorney Jonathan Pierce tried to paint Ezekiel as a man who had been corrupted by the harsh realities of frontier life, arguing that the isolation and lawlessness of the Ozarks had driven him to madness. Pierce claimed that Martha and the children had been unwilling participants, forced to go along with Ezekiel's schemes out of fear for their own lives. He argued that the killings had been acts of self-defense, claiming that the victims had threatened the family or attempted to rob the inn. But the evidence was overwhelming, and the defense's arguments were undermined by the systematic nature of the crimes and the clear evidence of premeditation. The discovery of the workshop, the detailed records and the sophisticated disposal methods made it clear that the murders were not desperate acts of self-defense, but carefully planned crimes motivated by greed. The defense's attempts to create reasonable doubt were further hampered by the testimony of Rebecca Holloway, who broke down under cross-examination and confessed to her role in luring victims to their deaths. Her testimony revealed the psychological manipulation that had been used to maintain the family's unity and the extent to which even the youngest members had been involved in the conspiracy. Rebecca described how she had been trained from a young age to identify wealthy travelers and engage them in conversation to determine their travel plans and financial status. She had learned to ask seemingly innocent questions that would reveal whether a guest was likely to be missed if they disappeared. Her testimony also revealed the twisted moral framework that Ezekiel had created to justify the family's actions. He had convinced his children that their victims were corrupt and evil, that they were taking from those who had gained their wealth through exploitation and giving it to those who deserved it more. The jury deliberated for less than 2 hours before returning guilty verdicts on all counts. The speed of their decision reflected the overwhelming nature of the evidence and the horror that the case had inspired in the community. Ezekiel, Martha, and Caleb Holloway were sentenced to death by hanging, while Rebecca, who had been portrayed as a reluctant participant and whose testimony had helped convict the others, received a sentence of life in prison. The sentences were met with approval from the packed courtroom, though some observers noted that even death seemed inadequate punishment for such heinous crimes. The executions were carried out on a cold morning in November 1883, with hundreds of spectators gathering to watch justice being served. The event was covered extensively by newspapers, with reporters describing the final moments of the condemned killers in graphic detail. Ezekiel Holloway went to his death unrepentant, claiming that he had only done what was necessary to provide for his family. In his final statement, he argued that the law had no authority in the wilderness and that he had been justified in taking whatever he needed to survive. He showed no remorse for his victims, describing them as weak and foolish for trusting strangers. Martha remained silent throughout the proceedings, refusing to make any final statement or show any sign of remorse. Witnesses described her as appearing almost catatonic, as if she had retreated into herself to escape the reality of her situation. Some observers speculated that she had suffered a complete mental breakdown. Caleb broke down completely in his final moments, confessing to additional murders that had not been part of the official charges. He described killings that had taken place before the family's arrival in Missouri, suggesting that their criminal activities had begun much earlier than investigators had realized. The confessions that emerged during the executions revealed that the Holloway family's crimes extended far beyond what had been proven in court. Caleb described murders in Kansas, Arkansas, and even as far away as Texas, suggesting that the family had been operating as traveling killers for years before settling in the Ozarks. These revelations prompted additional investigations in other states, but the evidence was often too old or too scattered to result in additional prosecutions. The full extent of the Holloway family's crimes would never be known, but estimates suggested that they may have killed as many as 100 people over a period of more than a decade. But the story of the Holloway Inn didn't end with the executions. In the weeks that followed, something strange began to happen. Newspaper articles about the case started disappearing from archives. Court records were mysteriously misfiled or lost. Even the inn itself was torn down, and the land sold to a buyer whose identity was kept secret. It was as if someone with significant power and influence was working to erase the Holloway murders from history. And indeed, that's exactly what was happening. The federal government, concerned about the impact that such a horrific case might have on westward expansion and tourism in the region, had decided that the story was too damaging to be allowed to survive. Officials argued that publicizing the details of the Holloway murders would discourage settlers from moving west and damage the region's reputation for years to come. They also worried that the case might inspire copycat crimes, creating a wave of violence that could destabilize the entire frontier. The decision to suppress the story was made at the highest levels of government, with President Chester Arthur himself reportedly approving the plan. Federal agents were dispatched to collect and destroy records related to the case, while newspaper editors were pressured to stop covering the story. The suppression campaign was remarkably thorough and effective. Government agents visited newspaper offices, courthouses, and private homes, collecting and destroying any documents related to the case. They offered financial incentives to witnesses and participants to remain silent, and they used threats and intimidation against those who refused to cooperate. The campaign was aided by the natural tendency of frontier communities to move on from traumatic events. Life in the Ozarks was hard enough without dwelling on past horrors, and many residents were happy to put the nightmare behind them and focus on building a better future. But some individuals refused to forget. Detective Marcus Webb, who had risked his life to expose the family's crimes, spent the rest of his career fighting the government's efforts to suppress the story. He wrote detailed reports about the case and tried to interest publishers in printing a book about the murders, but he was consistently blocked by federal officials who claimed that national security was at stake. Webb's persistence made him a target of government harassment. He was transferred to remote assignments, passed over for promotions, and eventually forced into early retirement. But he never stopped documenting what he had discovered at the Holloway Inn, creating a secret archive of evidence that he hoped would someday see the light of day. Webb's secret archives contained not just evidence from the Holloway case, but also information about the broader criminal network that the family had been part of. He had documented connections between the Holloways and criminal activities in at least 6 other states, revealing a pattern of murders and disappearances that suggested the existence of multiple killing families operating throughout the frontier regions. The archives also contained evidence of corruption at the highest levels of government, including documents that suggested some federal officials had been aware of the Holloway family's activities but had chosen to ignore them for political reasons. The suppression of the case was not just about protecting the region's reputation, but also about covering up the government's own failures. Other participants in the investigation also faced pressure to remain silent. Local law enforcement officers were warned that discussing the case could result in the loss of their jobs, while federal agents were transferred to other assignments and sworn to secrecy about their involvement. The suppression campaign extended beyond just silencing witnesses. Physical evidence from the case was systematically destroyed, with crime scene photographs burned and exhibits from the trial mysteriously disappearing from court storage. Even the remains of victims were quietly reburied in unmarked graves, making it impossible for future investigators to re-examine the evidence. The Holloway property itself was subjected to a thorough cleansing. The inn was demolished and burned, with the ashes scattered to prevent any possibility of the site becoming a morbid tourist attraction. The land was then sold to a consortium of investors who subdivided it and sold it to farmers who were unaware of its dark history. The government's efforts to erase the Holloway story were aided by the primitive state of communication and record-keeping in the 1880s. Without modern databases and communication networks, it was relatively easy to make documents disappear and prevent information from spreading beyond a limited geographic area. The campaign was also helped by the fact that many of the victims had been traveling alone and had few family connections in the area. Their disappearances had not generated sustained public attention, making it easier to suppress the story of their murders. But the suppression of the Holloway case had unintended consequences that would reverberate for decades. By hiding the truth about the murders, the government may have prevented other potential victims from taking proper precautions when traveling through remote areas. The case could have served as a warning about the dangers of frontier travel and the need for better law enforcement in isolated regions. The suppression also denied justice to the families of victims, many of whom never learned what had happened to their loved ones. Some families spent years searching for missing relatives, never knowing that their loved ones had been murdered and buried in unmarked graves in the Missouri Ozarks. The psychological impact on the local community was also significant. Residents who had witnessed the investigation and trial were forced to carry the burden of their knowledge in silence, unable to process their trauma through normal social channels. Some developed lasting psychological problems as a result of this enforced silence. The case also highlighted the role that corruption had played in enabling the Holloway's crimes. The investigation revealed that the family had been part of a larger network of criminals operating throughout the frontier regions, a network that included corrupt officials, crooked merchants, and other criminal families who had learned to exploit the weaknesses of frontier law enforcement. This network operated through a system of mutual protection and information sharing. Members would warn each other about law enforcement activities, provide false alibis when needed, and help dispose of stolen goods through established channels. The Holloways had been just one node in this larger criminal enterprise. The discovery of this network prompted federal officials to launch a broader investigation into frontier crime, but this investigation was also suppressed as part of the campaign to hide the Holloway story. The government was concerned that exposing the extent of frontier corruption would undermine public confidence in law enforcement and discourage westward expansion. The suppression of the broader investigation meant that other criminal families and networks were allowed to continue operating, potentially claiming additional victims. The decision to prioritize political considerations over public safety would have lasting consequences for frontier communities. The Holloway case occurred during a period of rapid social and economic change in America. The frontier was closing, the railroad was connecting distant regions, and the federal government was asserting greater control over previously lawless areas. The family's crimes represented a last gasp of frontier violence, a throwback to an earlier era when might made right and human life was cheap. But the murders also revealed the dark side of American individualism and self-reliance. The Holloways had taken the frontier ethos of independence and twisted it into a justification for murder. They had convinced themselves that they were simply doing what was necessary to survive in a harsh and unforgiving environment. The case also demonstrated the vulnerability of the transportation and communication systems that were essential to westward expansion. Travelers were isolated and vulnerable, dependent on the hospitality of strangers and unable to communicate quickly with the outside world if they encountered trouble. The Holloway Inn had exploited these vulnerabilities perfectly, creating a trap that was almost impossible to escape once a victim had entered. The family's success in avoiding detection for so long revealed the inadequacy of frontier law enforcement and the need for better coordination between different jurisdictions. The investigation into the Holloway murders was hampered by the primitive state of forensic science in the 1880s. Investigators had to rely on basic techniques like measuring wounds and examining clothing to determine how victims had died. They had no way to identify remains through DNA analysis or to determine precise times of death. Despite these limitations, the investigators were able to build a compelling case against the family through careful examination of physical evidence and witness testimony. The discovery of Ezekiel's ledger was particularly important, as it provided a detailed record of the family's crimes and helped investigators identify specific victims. The trial of the Holloway family was notable for its use of photographic evidence, which was still relatively new in criminal proceedings. Investigators had photographed the crime scenes, the remains, and the evidence found on the property, creating a visual record that helped jurors understand the scope of the family's crimes. The photographs were particularly effective in demonstrating the systematic nature of the murders and the careful planning that had gone into disposing of the bodies. Images of the basement workshop and the burial sites provided compelling evidence of premeditation and organization. The public reaction to the Holloway trial was intense, with newspapers providing daily coverage of the proceedings and editorial writers debating the implications of the case. Some argued that the murders were an inevitable result of frontier conditions and weak law enforcement, while others saw them as evidence of a deeper moral decay in American society. The trial also sparked debates about the death penalty and the appropriate punishment for mass murder. Some argued that hanging was too quick and merciful for killers who had shown no mercy to their victims, while others worried that public executions were becoming too much like entertainment. The coverage of the trial in national newspapers helped to spread awareness of the case beyond the local region, but this publicity also contributed to the government's decision to suppress the story. Officials were concerned that the case was damaging America's reputation both domestically and internationally. The executions of the Holloway family members were attended by hundreds of spectators, reflecting the public's desire to see justice served. But the government's subsequent efforts to suppress the story meant that this sense of closure was short-lived. and the case quickly faded from public memory. The location where the Holloway Inn once stood remained vacant for decades after the building was demolished. Local residents avoided the area, claiming that it was haunted by the spirits of the murder victims. Some reported seeing strange lights or hearing unexplained sounds, while others claimed to have encountered ghostly figures walking through the woods. These supernatural reports may have been products of guilt and trauma, as the local community struggled to come to terms with the fact that such horrific crimes had occurred in their midst. The residents had welcomed the Holloway family as neighbors and friends, never suspecting that they were living alongside mass murderers. The psychological impact of the case on the local community was profound and lasting. Many residents reported having nightmares about the murders, while others developed a deep distrust of strangers that persisted for years. The case shattered the sense of security that had characterized rural life in the region. Children who had grown up during the time of the murders were particularly affected, with many developing lasting fears about traveling alone or staying in unfamiliar places. The case became a cautionary tale that was passed down through generations, even as the official records were being suppressed. The case also had a lasting impact on law enforcement practices in the region. The Missouri State Police, which was established partly in response to the Holloway murders, implemented new procedures for investigating missing persons cases and coordinating between different jurisdictions. The federal government also began to take a more active role in frontier law enforcement, recognizing that local authorities were often inadequate to deal with sophisticated criminal enterprises like the one operated by the Holloway family. This increased federal involvement helped to reduce crime in frontier regions, but also contributed to the centralization of power that would characterize American law enforcement in the 20th century. The Holloway case also influenced the development of criminal investigation techniques and forensic science. The systematic approach used by Detective Webb became a model for future investigations, while the use of photographic evidence and expert testimony set precedents that would be followed for decades. The case demonstrated the importance of interagency cooperation and information sharing in law enforcement. The Holloways had been able to operate across state lines, partly because different jurisdictions did not communicate effectively with each other. The investigation also revealed the need for better record-keeping and documentation in criminal cases. The Holloways had exploited gaps in official records to create false identities and cover their tracks, highlighting the importance of maintaining accurate and comprehensive databases. The suppression of the Holloway case represented a missed opportunity to learn important lessons about criminal behavior and law enforcement. The case could have provided valuable insights into the psychology of serial killers and the social factors that enable their crimes. The systematic nature of the Holloway murders, with their careful victim selection, methodical disposal of evidence, and sophisticated support network, bore similarities to modern organized crime operations. The family's ability to operate for years without detection demonstrated the importance of community vigilance and professional law enforcement. The psychological dynamics within the Holloway family also offered insights into how criminal organizations recruit and maintain loyalty among their members. The family's shared delusion that their actions were justified created a closed system of belief that insulated them from moral doubt and external criticism. The case also highlighted the vulnerability of marginalized populations to criminal predation. Many of the Holloway victims were immigrants, minorities, or people traveling alone without strong social connections. Their disappearances were less likely to be investigated thoroughly, making them ideal targets for predators who understood how to exploit social inequalities. The government's decision to suppress the Holloway story reflects broader tensions between transparency and security that continue to shape American society today. While officials may have had legitimate reasons for wanting to prevent copycat crimes and protect the region's reputation, their actions also denied the public access to information that could have helped prevent similar tragedies. The success of the suppression campaign demonstrates the power of government to control historical narratives and shape public memory. The case shows how effectively information can be buried when powerful interests are determined to hide the truth. But the suppression also reveals the limitations of such efforts. Despite the government's best efforts, the story of the Holloway murders survived in whispered conversations and family legends. The truth has a way of persisting, even when official channels try to bury it. It wasn't until the 1970s that researchers began to piece together the full story of the Holloway murders. A graduate student at the University of Missouri, working on a thesis about frontier crime, discovered some of Webb's hidden documents in the basement of an old courthouse that was being demolished. The documents led to other discoveries, and slowly the true scope of the Holloway family's crimes began to emerge from the shadows of history. The rediscovery of the Holloway story was part of a broader movement to uncover hidden chapters of American history. Scholars and activists began to challenge official narratives and seek out suppressed stories, particularly those involving marginalized communities and government misconduct. This process of historical recovery continues today, as researchers use new technologies and methods to uncover evidence of past crimes and injustices. The Holloway case serves as an example of how persistent investigation can eventually bring hidden truths to light, even decades after the fact. The case also demonstrates the importance of preserving historical records and protecting them from destruction or suppression. The loss of evidence and documentation from the Holloway case represents a significant blow to our understanding of frontier crime and law enforcement. Modern researchers have used advanced forensic techniques to re-examine some of the surviving evidence from the case, but much has been lost forever due to the government's suppression efforts. This loss represents not just a historical tragedy, but also a missed opportunity to learn important lessons about criminal behavior. The moral lessons of the Holloway murders remain relevant in an age of increasing social isolation and declining community bonds. The family's ability to operate undetected for years was partly due to the lack of strong social networks that might have noticed and investigated suspicious behavior. The case also demonstrates the importance of maintaining healthy skepticism about appearances and reputation. The Holloways were able to commit their crimes partly because they had cultivated an image of respectability that made it difficult for others to believe they could be capable of such evil. The victims of the Holloway murders were denied justice, not only by their killers, but also by a system that chose to hide their stories rather than honor their memory. Their names and faces were erased from history, their families left to wonder what had happened to their loved ones. Today, as we remember their stories, we acknowledge not only the horror of their deaths, but also the courage they showed in pursuing their dreams, despite the dangers of frontier life. They represent the best of American values, the willingness to take risks, to seek opportunity, to trust in the kindness of strangers. Among the victims were people from all walks of life. There was Thomas Henderson, a young man from Ohio who was traveling to California to join his brother in the gold fields. There was Margaret Collins, a widow who was moving to Arkansas to live with her sister after her husband's death. There was Father Miguel Santos, a Catholic priest who was traveling to establish a mission in the Ozarks. Each of these people had dreams, families, and futures that were cut short by the Holloways' greed. They trusted in the basic human decency that hospitality represents, only to discover too late that their hosts were monsters in disguise. The Holloway Inn may be gone, its foundations scattered and its secrets buried, but the lessons of what happened there continue to resonate. They remind us that evil can hide behind the most ordinary facades, that justice delayed is justice denied, and that the price of freedom is eternal vigilance against those who would exploit our trust and vulnerability. In the end, the macabre well hidden behind the Holloway Inn was not just a story of murder and greed, but a reflection of the broader struggles that defined America in the 19th century. It was a tale of civilization and savagery, of progress and regression, of the eternal human capacity for both great good and unspeakable evil. The 63 souls who perished at the hands of the Holloway family deserve to be remembered not as footnotes in a suppressed history, but as individuals whose lives mattered, whose deaths demand justice, and whose stories serve as a warning to future generations about the price of turning away from uncomfortable truths. Their legacy lives on in the lessons we can learn from their tragedy, in the improvements to law enforcement and criminal justice that their deaths helped inspire, and in the ongoing struggle to ensure that such horrors never again go unnoticed, uninvestigated, or unpunished. The Holloway Inn murders stand as a testament to the dark possibilities that lurk beneath the surface of civilized society, but also to the power of truth to eventually overcome even the most determined efforts at suppression. In telling their story, we honor not only the victims, but also the principle that justice, however delayed, must ultimately prevail. And so the story of the Holloway Inn serves as both a warning and a promise. A warning that evil can flourish when good people remain silent, and a promise that truth, no matter how deeply buried, will eventually find its way to the surface. The macabre well hidden behind the Holloway Inn may have been sealed by those who feared its contents, but the waters of truth continue to seep through the cracks, reminding us that some stories are too important to be forgotten, no matter how powerful the forces arrayed against them. The investigation into the Holloway murders revealed disturbing details about the methods used to select and process victims. The family had developed an almost industrial approach to murder, with each member playing a specific role in the deadly operation. Ezekiel served as the mastermind and executioner, while Martha acted as the lure, using her maternal appearance to put guests at ease. The children served as scouts and assistants, helping to identify potential victims and dispose of evidence. The family's ledger contained detailed profiles of their victims, including information about their backgrounds, travel plans, and the amounts of money they carried. This information was gathered through careful questioning during meals and casual conversation, with each family member trained to extract specific types of information without arousing suspicion. The Holloways had also developed a sophisticated system for disposing of stolen goods. They worked with a network of corrupt merchants and traders who would purchase items at below-market prices and transport them to distant cities where they could be sold without raising questions. This network extended across multiple states and included some of the most respected businessmen in the region. The family's success in avoiding detection was also due to their careful attention to timing and logistics. They would space out their murders to avoid creating obvious patterns, and they would vary their methods to make it difficult for investigators to connect different cases. They also maintained detailed records of law enforcement activities in the region, allowing them to adjust their operations when necessary. The psychological profile of the Holloway family reveals a disturbing dynamic of shared delusion and mutual enablement. Ezekiel appears to have been a charismatic psychopath who convinced his family that murder was not only acceptable, but necessary for their survival. He created a twisted moral framework that portrayed their victims as corrupt and deserving of death. Martha, rather than being a reluctant participant, seems to have embraced her role as the family's primary lure. She took pride in her ability to make guests feel safe and welcome. Even as she was planning their deaths, her maternal appearance and nurturing behavior were weapons that she wielded with deadly effectiveness. The children were raised in an environment where killing was normalized and justified as a form of frontier justice. They learned to see their victims not as human beings, but as resources to be harvested, a mindset that allowed them to participate in mass murder without apparent remorse. This family dynamic challenges our assumptions about how evil develops and spreads. The Holloways weren't a collection of individual psychopaths who happened to find each other. They were a family unit that had collectively descended into darkness, creating their own moral universe where murder was not only acceptable, but praiseworthy. The investigation also revealed the sophisticated methods the family used to avoid detection. They had established relationships with corrupt officials in multiple states who would help them dispose of stolen goods and provide false documentation when needed. They had also developed a network of informants who would alert them to potential victims and warn them of any law enforcement activity in the area. This level of organization suggests that the Holloway murders were not the work of isolated killers, but part of a larger criminal enterprise that may have included other families and individuals throughout the region. The full extent of this network was never uncovered, partly because of the government's decision to suppress the investigation. The physical evidence from the Holloway property painted a picture of industrial-scale murder. The basement workshop contained not just surgical tools but also equipment for processing and preserving human remains. There were vats that appeared to have been used for dissolving flesh, furnaces for burning bones, and storage areas for keeping valuables until they could be safely sold. The family had also constructed an elaborate system of tunnels and hidden chambers throughout the property, allowing them to move bodies and evidence without being seen by other guests or neighbors. These tunnels connected the inn to various outbuildings and burial sites, creating a hidden infrastructure of death that operated beneath the surface of normal life. Perhaps most disturbing was the discovery of what appeared to be a trophy room in the inn's attic, where the family had kept personal items from their victims. Photographs, letters, jewelry, and other mementos were carefully organized and labeled, suggesting that the Holloways took pleasure in remembering their crimes and reliving the moments when they had held power over life and death. The psychological impact of the Holloway murders extended far beyond the immediate victims and their families. The case shattered the sense of security that many Americans felt about traveling and staying in frontier inns. It revealed that the hospitality industry, which was essential to westward expansion, could be used as a cover for the most heinous crimes imaginable. The government's decision to suppress the story was driven partly by economic concerns. Officials worried that publicizing the Holloway murders would damage the tourism industry and discourage investment in frontier regions. They also feared that the case would reinforce negative stereotypes about the frontier as a lawless and dangerous place. But the suppression of the story had unintended consequences. By hiding the truth about the Holloway murders, the government may have prevented other potential victims from taking proper precautions when traveling through remote areas. It also denied justice to the families of victims, many of whom never learned what had happened to their loved ones. The case also highlights the role that corruption played in enabling the Holloways' crimes. Local officials had been paid to look the other way when travelers went missing, and federal agents had been bribed to avoid investigating certain areas. This corruption created a zone of impunity where killers could operate without fear of consequences. Today, more than a century after the murders, the story of the Holloway Inn remains largely unknown to the general public. The government's campaign to suppress the case was so successful that most Americans have never heard of the family or their crimes. This deliberate erasure raises disturbing questions about what other stories have been buried by those in power. The Holloway murders serve as a reminder that evil can hide behind the most ordinary facades, and that the price of freedom is eternal vigilance against those who would exploit our trust and vulnerability. They also demonstrate the importance of transparency and accountability in government, and the dangers of allowing political considerations to override the pursuit of justice. The victims of the Holloway murders deserve to be remembered not just as statistics, but as individuals whose lives were cut short by unimaginable cruelty. They were pioneers and dreamers, people who had the courage to venture into unknown territories in search of better lives for themselves and their families. Their deaths serve as a reminder of the price that was paid for America's westward expansion, not just in terms of conflict with Native Americans or environmental destruction, but also in terms of the human cost of creating civilization in lawless regions where predators could operate with impunity. The Holloway family's crimes were enabled by a perfect storm of factors: remote location, weak law enforcement, transient population, and a culture that valued independence over community oversight. These same factors continue to create opportunities for criminal activity in modern America, from rural areas with limited police presence to online environments where anonymity can shield predators from consequences. The story of the Holloway Inn stands as both a warning and a testament to the power of truth to eventually overcome even the most determined efforts at suppression. In telling their story, we honor not only the victims but also the principle that justice, however delayed, must ultimately prevail.